Welcome and good morning, everyone. My name is David Ucko, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be moderating this Chancellor's Lecture Series featuring Ambassador Jeffrey and retired Lieutenant General Michael Nagata. At a National Defense University, and particularly in the College of International Security Affairs, we spend a lot of time studying and talking about irregular warfare, the theory, the concepts, and the strategies. It never fails to impress upon me that we are, of course, teaching practitioners who have to leave this university and do the difficult work of actually solving real-world crises and problems in the field. And so I think it's healthy and necessary for us to engage regularly with those who have been tested at the very highest levels precisely in this challenge. And so I appreciate very much the opportunity for us to engage with and to learn from these two distinguished gentlemen who together combine decades of senior-most experience in the United States government dealing with irregular challenges and irregular warfare around the world. You've already been handed their bios, and I've promised not to read them verbatim. It's the most inauspicious start to what should be a spirited discussion. But I do just want to emphasize for a moment the range of irregular warfare experience that we have represented here on this panel. Starting with Ambassador Jeffrey, he started his career as an Army officer in Vietnam in the 1970s. He's been a Foreign Service officer, and he's stationed in eastern Turkey during the 1984 outbreak of the PKK insurgency, a topic we will turn to shortly in our Dynamics of Irregular Warfare class. He was Chief of Staff of the Bosnian ceasefire implementation team in '96. He's overseen the State Department engagement in Operation Northern Watch, worked for Iraq for 4 years as DCM, Chargé, State Department lead and ambassador, and co-led the National Security Council Deputies Counterterrorism Committee from 2007 to 2008. He also coordinated the US-Russian presidential communications during the 2008 Georgia conflict, engaging therefore in state-based irregular warfare, which now of course has become very familiar to us. And he managed the counter-PKK policy from 2007 to 2010. And of course, served as special envoy for Syria, as well as for the Defeat ISIS campaign in 2018 to 2020. So, as you can tell, we have with us someone who knows irregular warfare from a very practical and an extremely senior perspective. Lieutenant General Michael Nagata of the US Army spent 34 years in the US Special Operations community, starting in the 1990s, so commanding an ODA attachment in the 80s, and then serving in and eventually commanding a special missions unit with deployments around the world and on several assignments, including in Somalia in '93, and also in the initial combat deployments following the 9/11 attacks. At the strategic level, Michael Nagata has commanded the Special Operations Command Central. He was Director of Strategy at the NCTC from 2016 to 2019. And he's also served in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, within the intelligence community as a Deputy Director for Counterterrorism, and as a Deputy Chief of the Office of the Defense Representative to Pakistan. And finally, as a Deputy Director for Special Operations and Counterterrorism at the J37. So again, we have from the military and from the civilian side of the government just heaps of very impressive and very senior level experience. So I will step down because I'm definitely the least interesting person on this panel, and I will allow our speakers to provide their prepared comments, and then I hope for a very educational and spirited Q&A with real-world implications, I think, for everyone in this room. So with that said, welcome, thank you for being with us, and over to Ambassador Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, David. Thank you to my colleague, Ambassador Greta Holtz, my colleague Denise Marsh for recruiting us and getting us here today, and thank you all for coming. I'll try to be as brief as possible with my introductory remarks. And much of what I'm going to cover on irregular warfare and the current international environment, the strategic competition that we're all in, you've heard before. And you may be wondering, why am I hearing it again? The reason is, I would argue, while we all have heard this, it has not yet become the accepted wisdom in Washington and in other capitals around the world, because we're moving from a transition after 1989 and the following 30 years where there was one global system that was pretty much predominant to a period of challenge. And people have not gotten their minds around this yet, so today I'll try to help, at least in this group, change that. First of all, in all of this, the dramatic significance of Ukraine cannot be underestimated. This is without doubt the most important international event, including 9/11, since the fall of the wall in 1989. In many respects, it's even more important. It marks the first time in 77 years that the international system that was put in place in 1945 and beyond to avoid the horrors of the world from 1914 to 1945 has truly been challenged. That a major power, in this case Russia, to some degree over the horizon China's eyeing Taiwan in the same way, has decided to upturn the rule that great powers do not wage major war in this world against the rest of the system. And we're all trying to deal with that now. The preliminary conclusion I have is that the principles of irregular warfare that you learn here at CISA are going to be applicable even in this strategic or great power competition at two levels. At the level of what I call the specific fronts, those countries or areas or sectors, if it's cyber or intelligence or energy, where competition is carried out, it's going to follow those principles, beginning with the focus on not territory or military power, but people, their loyalties, legitimacy, and that kind of thing. And secondly, the entire campaign that these countries are waging against us, and as we're waking up, we all, and by we all, not we all Americans, we all, the global community, wage in defense, is going to look a lot like irregular warfare. So that's the good news. I have a lot of bad news, but we'll start with that. All right, the current situation of strategic competition can draw from many historical examples. You start with perhaps the Persians versus the Greeks in the ancient world, or Rome versus Carthage. But what we're dealing with today looks a lot like the Cold War. You have the two primary challenges to an international system, Russia and China, along with some allies, one of which is a repeat offender, North Korea. And you have, in many respects, a similar dynamic. There are some differences that I'll get to in a second, but let's hold with that point. On the side of the international community, you have what amounts to a world order. It is not a formal world order. The formal part of it, the UN is probably, particularly the Security Council, is the weakest link. But rather, it is a set of agreed norms, practices, institutions, ways of doing things that have built up since 1945, again, to avoid returning to 1914, 1945, and it's been tremendously successful. At the center is a collective security system. But like everything else in this world order, it's pretty informal and it's kind of amorphous. The only thing that's clear about it is that the United States is at the center with a set of regional alliances in the Americas and, of course, in Europe with NATO, and a whole variety of hub and spoke alliances or security partnerships with many of the countries who are represented with students here today, some 80 or 90 around the world. But again, this is within an environment of a larger system that covers things like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the freedom of the seas, trade, monetary issues such as the SWIFT system that allows dollars and other currencies to move seamlessly around the world. This is a whole system. It has no leadership in a formal sense. To the extent there is somebody who's in charge, it would probably be the G7, the United States, Canada, Japan, and the four largest European economies. But again, that's also informal. Yet it does work, and as we're seeing with Ukraine, to the surprise of everybody, including me, it's quite resilient, and it can rear up and react to a true challenge to it, which is what we see today. The strength of this system is, to borrow a phrase from Clausewitz, it is defensive, and that means it's inherently the stronger. But by the same token, it's also passive. It basically exists to preserve itself. It doesn't have a game plan to deal with, or a clear one to deal with challenges to it other than to fend them off. It has weaknesses. Again, the leadership is amorphous. We can say that we here in Washington are leading the system, but you can't point to any institutional or other clear manifestation of that, and Washington gets disappointed all of the time, as it just did with the OPEC decision. So the leadership is pretty loose. It also is a free goods system. Everybody in the world can benefit from freedom of the seas. Everybody in the world can benefit from a general security environment, but each country's or group of people's contribution to it is not set. Some do a lot, some do very little, some do nothing. And that means that the whole is weaker than the sum of the parts. Finally, a collective security system, and we saw this best in Vietnam, but we've seen it also in other places, has a predicament attached to it. The whole idea of collective security is one for all and all for one. But what happens when that one, that the rest of us all have to go to their defense, is weak, badly run, and probably deserves to be overthrown by the other side because of its crappy government and the bad things it does to its own people? And also, it may not be a very important place. What do you do? If you commit on the principle of all for one, you can get bogged down. And we saw repeatedly what that does to our populations over time. If you don't, the whole system begins to shake. If you don't react to a Hong Kong, if you don't react to a Crimea, pretty soon a Japan or a Great Britain are beginning to wonder, are we next? Are we going to be abandoned? The answer is probably no, but that's the problem with the system. Now, the foes, China and Russia. Their problem is their constitutional system in the little c way, which is dictatorship, does not fit well into the modern, relatively liberal, open, liberal world. They are strong enough to want to push for what I would call a 19th century agenda of tearing down a global system that they don't get to run. But they do not want to challenge that openly because of the fear not only of nuclear war, but also of the huge cost and uncertainty of conventional war on a large scale. Look what happened when Germany and Japan tried that during World War II. And you can see just in Ukraine how dangerous it is even to do a small conventional war these days, even for a major power like Russia. So they're looking for a way to advance their agenda without getting to the point of crossing the threshold of real combat with the rest of the world. What is the answer? One or another form of what you learn here is irregular warfare. And I've seen the definitions, they're changing, but you all know what we're talking about. All elements of power focused on populations to advance overall political goals, including very often the use of violence or the threat of violence. Their motivations, again, they're mixed, but they have their weaknesses. First of all, unlike in the Cold War, these countries do not have a philosophy. We can chuckle at the people who believed in communism, but for much of the 20th century, people all around the world, from Hanoi to Havana, believed in communism as an alternative to the liberal world order. They don't have anything like that now. They're also, both Russia and China, integrated into the world economy, and that is a weakness for them because they have more at stake, but it's also a weakness for us. Again, the way that they'll do that without breaking up all of their relations is to find ways to pick the weakest links in our chain of collective security, exploit that predicament. Do we engage and get bogged down? Do we pass on that particular challenge and make the whole system shake? In terms of what a specific front, a specific country, or a specific engagement will be, what we're going to see in the future will not be very different than what many of you have experienced in the last 20 to 30 years, and those of us up here on the stage have experienced. But there will be a few things that are notably, if not different, there'll be a different accent. And I would use both the campaign against the Islamic State, although that wasn't a great power competition. It's a very good example of the new way people are approaching things and the current Ukraine crisis. First of all, we'll be doing far more by, with, and through, or I guess the word now from the National Security Strategy is partner-led, U.S.-enabled, as opposed to in the past it was U.S.-led, and believe me, the lead was often very heavy and partner-enabled. Secondly, the definition of victory is going to be very broad. Go through the list of Ds. Delay, discourage, deter, disrupt, diminish, all the way through to defeat and utterly destroy. You have a broad set of possible outcomes. The most important is that in a passive, defensive, contain and deter strategy, which is the closest thing that this global order has to a strategy, anything from status quo ante forward is a success. The most important thing is that the other side does not gain something material, and it cannot use that to go on to further gains. It may not stop them from trying, but again, the most important thing is to ensure that it doesn't succeed. So you have a great variety of choices. For example, in the Korean War, after 3 years of bloody fighting, we basically got the status quo ante. And looking back over 70 years, that was good enough to make a major advance in our overall containment strategy throughout the entire Cold War. Now, there's some problems with this, or some special things. First of all, let's talk about populations. Again, in irregular warfare, including this new scenario, populations are going to be central. Their loyalties, legitimacy, and other things. But there's a significant difference from what we were doing over the last 30 years. Over the last 30 years, the primary goal of most of our interventions, beginning in the Balkans and certainly throughout the Middle East, was not to win hearts and minds, but to transform, to convert hearts and minds. We were on projects to change societies, populations, governments, to make them look, as a critic, Michael Mandelbaum once put it, more like Denmark. That was the primary line of effort. The military operations, even though at times they involved hundreds of thousands of people under arms, were a contributing line of effort, a secondary one, to fend off those who were trying to stop the primary goal. It will be different in irregular warfare. The primary mission is one of these Ds, a specific action against a foe to ensure that foe doesn't advance. You will have to work with the people, but that will be a supporting line of effort. Again, our efforts with the coalition to defeat the Islamic State are a good example. After a bit of back and forth, we had a clear D mission, destroy the Islamic State as a state. We had a by, with, and through philosophy with our local partners doing most of the fighting, and an 80-nation and organization coalition backing them up. When you look at the amount of money we put into that as a country, and our partners did, it's minuscule, some $35 billion in military costs, probably $10 billion in others for us, maybe $10 billion more for our European and Arab partners, apart from the Syrians and Iraqis, to defeat a major, major threat to the regional security of the Middle East. Furthermore, again, while we did work with populations, humanitarian assistance, stabilization funding, they weren't making them think differently was not our primary goal. We took those people and their organizations as they were. Now, this brings some of the problems up that we're going to deal with in irregular warfare, and I'll stop there. First of all, the goals that we might say, the D we might pick from somewhere between delay and utterly destroy, may not be the D that our friends on the ground, who we've now decided will be in the lead, will have. And you're seeing this today with Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine. I'm not quite sure what the U.S. goal in this conflict is beyond Ukraine doesn't disappear. I'm not quite sure what the Europeans, who are playing a big role in bearing more of a cost, see as the goal. And I'm not quite sure what Mr. Zelensky's real goal is. What I am sure is that they're not totally coordinated, and that's a problem. And that's something that will be ever more common when you're using the philosophy of partner-led, U.S.-enabled. What are we enabling? Secondly, these people have, beyond the specific conflict, their own agendas. We took our allies in the field as they were in the fight against Islamic State, and we were very successful. But that meant a PKK offshoot, the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of Peshmerga, and Iraqi army forces that reflected an underlying conflict between the two on the future of the state of Iraq, and a variety of Shia militias, some of whom were allied with Iran. That led to major confrontations throughout the entire conflict, particularly the mini-war between Erbil and Baghdad around Kirkuk in 2017, and then the Turkish intervention against the SDF twice, 2018, and then more dramatically 2019, and then our own mini-war with Iran in Iraq at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. Those are the spin-offs of this kind of campaign. We succeeded. We're still in the field. The Islamic State is still being suppressed, and this can be considered a success, but there's a lot of lessons there. Finally, how does this all end? I would turn to David here in his recent book, The Insurgent's Dilemma. At the end, David, you said, the people fighting the insurgents, and in this case, the global order is the established entity, and the insurgents are the Chinese and the Russians. We wait them out. I think that was your conclusion, right? And that's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. That's a riveting start to this session. Please, General Nagata, thank you.
Oh, wait, you haven't heard me yet. Thank you. In all seriousness, thank you for inviting me. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to be in your company again. These are two old colleagues and old friends, and I admire and looked up to both of them, so I'm delighted to be in your company again. So as you heard, I'm a retired general officer. For those of you that aren't aware, there's actually federal law that requires retired generals to tell war stories. Although I did select a story that I think is particularly appropriate to the topic at hand, I promise I'll be brief about this. It also has the virtue of being true. A lot of general officer war stories are not true. This one is actually true. But this happened in 2003. Note that year. That was the year we invaded Iraq. I was just graduating from the National War College. I had orders to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but I got a phone call from a former boss of mine saying, Nagata, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, you have an interview with a senior official in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, because that's where you're going. To which I said, sir, I have orders to go to Fort Bragg. To which he said, Nagata, you're not listening to me. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, you have an interview. So I spent the next 2 years of my life as an OSD staff officer. And here's the story. As the invasion was unfolding, we had taken Baghdad at this point. There was still a lot of military operations going on. I was summoned into my boss's office, and he said, okay, look, Colonel Nagata, I want you to do a little bit of a research project for a briefing that I want you to deliver to the senior leadership here in the Pentagon. Okay, sir, what's the topic? And he said, well, I want you to go to the National Archives, do some research, and put together a briefing that answers this question. What did the United States have to do to stabilize post-war Germany and post-war Japan? Put a briefing together, and we'll have all the senior people gathered for you to deliver that briefing in about a week. It was a really interesting exercise. I spent a week at the National Archives. I learned a lot. I put a hell of a briefing together. I was pretty impressed with myself. Oh my God, the amount of labor and the amount of effort and the amount of investment and the durability of the commitment the United States had to make. And that was basically the sum total of my briefing. So a week later, I'm back in the Pentagon. All the senior leaders are gathered. I give my briefing. At the end of my briefing, I said, gentlemen, that concludes my presentation. What are your questions? And my boss, who was sitting in the front row, just looked at me and he said, well, we're not going to do that. And that was pretty much a signal that nobody could ask any questions. Everybody got up, filed out of the room. I'm standing there and I'm thinking, well, If we're not going to do this, what are we going to do? The rest is history. Why do I tell you that story? Whether or not you consider what we had to do in Iraq contains some elements of irregular warfare, this is something that the United States government talks about a lot, does infrequently, although I would argue with growing frequency because of changes in the world, and often fails at. Not always, but often fails at. So the rest of my remarks are going to be an attempt to try to diagnose why that is, and maybe a few recommendations to consider about how do we get better at it. Not just the United States, but the United States and its allies, because often we drag our allies into these things. Let me stop with a couple of basic bits of information that I gathered in preparation for today's event. There's actually a definition of irregular warfare in the DoD dictionary. For those of you that did not know, yes, the Pentagon has a dictionary. You can look it up online. Here's the definition: a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over the relevant population. Note the use of the word violent. The problem with that is often irregular warfare doesn't contain a lot of violence. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. There was also an irregular warfare annex published in 2020 as a component of the National Defense Strategy. Here's what it says: irregular warfare is an enduring economical contribution to America's national security and will remain an essential core competency of the U.S. Department of Defense. I emphasize the word economical because I've frequently encountered a belief, a false belief, but a belief nonetheless, in Washington, D.C., that this is cheap. We can have enormously beneficial outcomes for very little investment. Completely untrue. But we write crap like this in our documents. And then I found a list elsewhere in a DoD document of all the components that can emerge in irregular warfare. And this is only part of the list: unconventional warfare, stabilization, foreign internal defense, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, military information operations, cyberspace operations, countering threat networks, counter-threat finance, civil military operations, security cooperation, on and on and on and on. That's the kind of definition that is no definition at all. It's just a laundry list. Now, why am I coming at this with such a somewhat negative, perhaps even cynical point of view? Here's what I've seen over a 30-plus year military career. Irregular warfare is one of the least preferred methods of warfare in the U.S. military. We generally prefer a far simpler, far more linear, and more emotionally gratifying delivery of overwhelming kinetic power to defeat or destroy an adversary, and thereby, at least theoretically, achieve whatever our strategic goals happen to be. And then as rapidly as possible get back to normal, whatever normal is. These are things that are, in my judgment, either disabilities or liabilities when it comes to the United States government, or frankly any government, in thinking clearly about when you consider using irregular warfare to accomplish your strategic goals, what are you talking about? What I've seen too much of, both in my government and in other governments, is people use the same term, but they don't all mean the same thing. And just the act of trying to rationalize in a group of senior leaders, among a group of policymakers, among a group of military planners, or foreign service officers, or intelligence community practitioners, we're saying irregular warfare. What the hell are we talking about? What are we trying to accomplish? what's our theory of success, and are we actually serious about doing it? So, I'll conclude my remarks by just giving you a list of things that I think I've learned the hard way, mostly by screwing this up, that should be very high on any government's priority list to seriously consider before you embark in an irregular warfare campaign. First of all, particularly in today's age, I'm going to use the United States as my example here. The United States is in a global contest over its own influence. That's my definition of strategic competition or great power competition. This is a global contest over American influence. In my view, at the end of World War II, America, for a whole host of reasons I won't go into here, found itself the most influential nation on earth. It managed to sustain that standing as generally the most influential nation on earth for decades. But I would argue in the last 20 years, a huge question mark has started to emerge over whether or not we are still that influential. In fact, I will go so far as to say we have lost a considerable amount of our strategic influence in recent years. But why? In large measure, because the United States made a series of decisions, often unconsciously, to become just another transactional actor on the world stage. That we would only give something if we got something in return, which is the nature of a transaction. Whereas at the end of World War II, however imperfectly, the United States decided to be the most generous nation on earth. That generosity, imperfect though it was, ham-handed as it often was, became the basis for a degree of influence that was unprecedented, certainly in American history, perhaps among the most influential nations in the history of mankind, on the basis of that generosity. But as we have abandoned generosity and become more transactional, we have lost that influence. And I do believe, as one of the definitions I gave you earlier, that irregular warfare is fundamentally a struggle over influence. It begs this question: is America or its allies willing to be generous enough in an irregular warfare campaign that we gain, maintain, or regain our influence? Next, there is a very close relationship. In some cases, they are the same thing between irregular warfare and proxy warfare. I'm hard-pressed to think of an irregular campaign I've been involved in where we did not enlist some form of a proxy. In some cases, it was a military actor. In some cases, it was a civilian actor. But nonetheless, someone who was doing something advantageous to us at our request because we didn't want to. So we basically hired someone to do it for us. Proxy warfare is as old as mankind. It's always been very convenient for civilizations since the dawn of mankind to have someone else do your fighting, your bleeding, and your dying for you. It's still very convenient to this day. What's changing is how powerful proxies are becoming. And the reason proxies are becoming increasingly powerful is because everywhere in the world, the barriers to entry to increasingly powerful technology are falling everywhere. Ambassador Jeffries and I had the pleasure of having to deal with ISIS drones. That's the tip of the iceberg. Anyone in the world can have access to space-based technologies, to robotics, to high-speed data processing, to enormous quantities of big data that can literally tell you everything about anyone on the planet you want to know. The list goes on and on and on. as actors everywhere, particularly non-state actors, get access to these increasingly powerful technologies at the same pace that a government can, and in some cases faster than a government can, because governments generally have procurement rules. That completely changes the dynamic of enlisting proxies. It still will be attractive, but at a minimum, future proxies will demand higher prices from their patron because they will be far more powerful. And the patron will have to recognize if I don't pay their price, they'll go work for somebody I don't like. All right, I know this has been very uplifting so far. I'm going to make my last point here. So what are the requirements for effective irregular warfare? I hope a large part of our Q&A focuses on this. So how do you get this right? I'm only going to list two things. The list is actually quite long in my view, but I'm going to highlight two because they're the ones I see large governments like the United States fail to do effectively most frequently. Number one, if you're going to engage in irregular warfare, you have to have a very high appetite for risk because you're not going to be in complete control of everything that happens. And I'm not just talking about the local foreign actor. You're going to have civilian interagency colleagues at your side throughout every bit of it, and they're not necessarily under your orders. Our risk tolerance in irregular warfare is often antagonistic to success at irregular warfare because we're not willing to take the risks. If you're signing up for irregular warfare, you're signing up for a boatload of risk. And if you're not ready for that, don't go down this road. Lastly, and in a way I talked about this briefly a moment ago, but I'm going to say it again because it's so important. One of the most important fundamental requirements to engage in effective irregular warfare is a policy attitude, a strategic attitude of generosity towards those we are going to have to work with. If you're going to be a transactional actor in modern irregular warfare, you are going to fail. All right. Hopefully that was provocative enough for at least a few questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Certainly provocative. And if I may, I'm going to just ask the first question, try to pick up a little bit on some of the themes that both of you alluded to. Ambassador Jeffrey, you spoke of a world order made up of a great many institutions that is defensive and passive, and that is one that China and Russia and others are trying to tear down because they don't get to run it. And they're doing this indirectly for a variety of strategic and capability-related reasons, picking at the weakest links or the weakest parts of the system. And you mentioned the notion of a partner-enabled response, also something emphasized in the national security strategy. And I guess that brings me to my question. It's a question that also touches very close to the heart of what CISA is trying to do in building networks and building those partnerships. Because the national security strategy also speaks about a sort of natural harmony of interests amongst those who believe in the system, and that we all coalesce around similar norms and rules and values. And I was wondering, particularly given your comments, about the question mark surrounding our strategic influence and our strategic norms. How strong is that natural harmony of interests? And if it isn't strong enough, what are the respective roles of diplomacy and the military in making it stronger? Can we win the struggle for legitimacy that irregular warfare is all about? If I could ask you to comment on this, and then we'll open it up, so please prepare your questions. Thank you.
I'll start. I think there is a commonality of interest in the global system as it is today. There is a lot of, within many capitals, including right here in Washington, some criticism of how it's organized, how it is run to the extent, as I mentioned earlier, it is rationally run, and how it could be improved. But nonetheless, it provides large-scale benefits of, again, to quote the National Security Strategy, freedom, openness, prosperity, and peace for most people in most places at most times over the past 75 years. But it is also a common good. It is something that is there whether you're contributing to it or not. And countries get to choose whether they want to be all in. The United Kingdom is perhaps the best example, in some respects, ahead of the United States in its conscious, rational, philosophical recognition of this order and its willingness to, as Mike Nagata said, take risks and be generous in supporting it. Other countries are more transactional. We work with them. I'll give two examples that I used in another context the other day. Turkey and Israel have been very helpful in some respects on Ukraine, but in others they have, given their security and economic interests with Russia, hesitated. And that has to be acceptable to us, because this amorphous global order is very resilient and it is very, very strong, but it is very, very particularistic. Now, how do you maximize its potential strength? The military role in that is you have to have a credible military capability to deter threats, and if you don't succeed, to contain them, push them back, as I said, at least status quo ante, if deterrence doesn't work. And you not only have to have that military capability, others, including your foes, have to believe you have that capability. But that is a component of a larger political or diplomatic engagement in the world, and here the 2 points that General Nagata made are very, very important in how you carry that out. You have to be risk open, and you have to be generous. You can't be transactional. You have to, and in a way, even, and I would argue that even after World War II, while we were extremely generous, we were actually, in a way, doing this not for the good of everybody. We're also doing it for the good of the United States. We'd been through 2 wars too. They weren't as horrific as they were to our European and Asian colleagues, but they were pretty dramatic. And we saw this as a way to preserve those 4 components: freedom, openness, prosperity, and peace, not just for the rest of the world, but also for us. And we basically concluded we couldn't be those 4 things if the rest of the world wasn't. That was our conclusion, and that led us down that road. We have to maintain that, and we have to be willing to take a risk. Now, the problem, and we can get into this later, because it's a huge theme here, it's a huge theme here at this school, it's a huge theme in Washington and around the world, and that is, from all of this we said this morning, the primacy of politics of policy is evident. Even in regular conventional war, that is the lodestar, and in irregular warfare, which is highly political, in the context of strategic competition, which is highly political, you've got several more geometric increases in the political policy side of this. But the political world, particularly but not only in liberal democracies, doesn't lend itself to taking risks and broad, long-term being generous. It wants maximum outcomes with minimum commitment. The best example of diplomatic irregular warfare success I saw was Dick Holbrooke in Bosnia. I came into that operation right after Dayton, but Dayton almost collapsed in early 1996, and so Holbrooke, the most junior of all of them by protocol, brought heads of state, foreign ministers, SACEUR, and others to Rome to try to settle this thing. And Holbrooke's rule was, A, you talk to everybody, you deal openly with everybody. B, massive military force with all the risks that entails is the only kind of military force you should even consider. I'll never forget him going down the corridor to see Milosevic, the Serbian president. He had, Holbrooke was a burly guy, he had burly Sakir Jalwin to his left and burly Admiral Snuffy Smith, the Southern Command NATO commander, on his right, and Holbrooke was tugging them by their uniform jackets to come with him to threaten Milosevic. But by the same token, those of us trailing behind him had a package of sweeteners and carrots to offer these guys. That was Holbrooke's success. Maximum cost for only minimal win-win for everybody gains. And that's what works in this world, but that runs contrary to what the political system at least is used to promising, which is no risk, no cost, and miracle results. And it's very difficult to get political establishments to accept those realities. Holbrooke could do it because I think Bill Clinton was afraid of him. We all were. Anyway.
I can't resist commenting on one thing the ambassador just said. It's a phrase that, well, it's not a phrase, it's a reality I've had to encounter more than I like to think about, where we tend to want maximal outcomes with the minimum investments. I've raised 5 children. Here's what I've learned as a parent. Children get to engage in that kind of thinking because they're children. Maximum outcome for no work at all. Okay, you're 10 years old. You get to think like that. The problem is when I see people that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s think like that. And that's when things like irregular warfare go sideways, because we think we're going to have maximum outcomes for no investment. But you asked me about relationships, so I think there are 2 points worth highlighting here. And this is going to sound like human relationships 101, but I've seen many governments, including my own, fail at these 2 things, and it always ends badly when we do. The first one is do what you say you're going to do. Otherwise, you have no credibility. When I was the commander of Special Operations Forces in the Middle East, was during that period when a previous U.S. Administration had publicly announced that if the Assad regime used chemical weapons against their own population, we would take military action. And then we didn't. Unfortunately, I was on a tour of the region. I have never had my face ripped off so often in so many nice offices and palaces in my life, but it was like being a punching bag for about a week, because I was the nearest senior U.S. military official, so whichever crown prince or foreign minister or defense minister I had to have an audience with just spent 30 minutes yelling at me. Do what you say you're going to do, or you're not going to have a relationship that's worth anything at all. And you're certainly not going to be able to count on people to join your irregular warfare campaign. Finally, invest in the small things. And here, again, I can't resist telling you a story, but I would argue this is a tiny story that, if replicated intentionally, can have long-term, maybe even permanent benefits at the strategic level. So here's the story. I'll make it very fast. In 1984, Jesus, I am old. 1984, Lieutenant Michael Nagata was going through the U.S. Army's Special Forces training course. That course that I ended up commanding in the 1990s always has a mix of international students. There was one particular student who was from an African country. Very impressive officer. But I knew he'd never been to the United States before. It's first time. And Fort Bragg, North Carolina is not the best part of the United States, for those of you that haven't been there. But he never lost an opportunity to talk about how much he loved America, which I thought was very odd because I knew he'd never been to America before. So one day, we were taking a break, and I went up to him and I said, you know, I appreciate how often you talk about how much you love America, but brother, you've never been here before. And this place sucks where we are right now. Why do you love America so much? And he asked me a question that I wasn't prepared for. He asked me, do you have any idea how I learned to read and write? I thought that was a complete non sequitur. No, I have no idea how you learn to read and write. What the hell does that have to do with anything? He said, well, when I was a young boy, I lived in a small village, and one day this stranger showed up, clearly a foreigner. So all of us children, we were very curious, who is this strange person? So we asked our parents, who is this man? Well, he was from America. He was from something that my parents said was the Peace Corps. He stayed in our village for a season. He taught all of the children in this village how to read and write. And then he looked at me and he said, had he not come to my village and taught me to read and write, I would never have gone to school. If I'd never gone to school, I would have never been able to join the military. I would never have become an officer, and I wouldn't be standing here today. And he said, Lieutenant Nagata, I love America. A small individual act of generosity that by itself doesn't mean much, but if done intentionally by any nation, not just the United States, can build a wave of goodwill and gratitude and affection. Note these are all emotional words that come in awfully handy when you need an ally for irregular warfare.
Thank you very much. That is a great transition point to open this up. We have around 30 minutes left for Q&A. I just ask that you please approach a microphone and also introduce yourself and where you're coming from in terms of agency and country, please. I know that we have one question all the way from Fort Bragg, I think. So
excellent. We actually have a ton of questions, so I thought if it's okay with you, Dr. Ucko, and they've really zeroed in on our guest speakers' remarks as well as some of the discussion we had in Ambassador Holtz's office prior. So I'll ask two, if that's okay, to get things going. So the first question comes from Yu Chang at CISA South in Fort Bragg, and it gets to General Nagata's as well as Ambassador Jeffrey's discussion of risk. General Nagata, you mentioned the struggle over influence with high risk tolerance in IW. What policies do we have in government to empower leaders to raise their risk acceptance? And the second question comes from Carolyn Davidson. She says, Ambassador Jeffries referenced containment. To what degree do both speakers see IW as a toolkit for containment? This gets to your defensive point, Ambassador Jeffrey, that is oriented towards security in the status quo rather than political change. And then the final piece of Carolyn's question it gets to the definition of IW, and that's the discussion we had with Ambassador Holtz. Do you prefer to see violence or the threat of violence included in the IW definition, or simply struggle is more appropriate in the context of great power competition?
Well, okay, I'll go ahead and start. Risk tolerance and policy. This is something I've collided with several times, particularly during my tours in Washington, D.C. It's not that there's no relationship between policy formulation and risk tolerance. It's just, it's not a particular strong relationship, at least in my experience. The way one creates risk tolerance is by effective leadership. When leaders demonstrate a willingness, indeed an enthusiasm for taking risk. Their subordinates do likewise, because that's what the boss is doing. If he's doing it, it must be the right thing to do. And then to make it even better, good leaders reward risk tolerance, even when people fail. You had the courage to try, you're the kind of person I'm going to promote. I don't care that it didn't work. You had the guts to try. Leadership creates risk tolerance. Policy does not. It's not that policy has no impact. It can have some, but it's very indirect. So the only way we get better risk tolerance, and I'm not just talking about irregular warfare, I'm really talking about everything, is through leadership example and leadership encouragement. You have good leadership, you'll get risk tolerance. You have bad leadership, you'll get zero risk tolerance. The use of the term violence in irregular warfare, well, we are calling it warfare. Warfare doesn't necessarily involve, breaking things and killing people, but typically it does. The problem I have with most things that I've seen written or debated about when it comes to irregular warfare is that particularly, and this is particularly true of military professionals, when all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. We often talk ourselves in the military into believing what we want to believe is that the solution has to be the use of force. Why? Because I've spent my whole life training to deliver force. I don't want to go through this without getting to do what I've spent my whole life training to do. And sometimes we fail to think about, well, maybe that's the wrong thing to do in this case, or maybe we don't need a lot of that. Maybe that's just a supplementary activity to support something that is more important that does not involve the use of violence. So there is a military community, a military culture tendency to bias ourselves towards the use of force, and often in cases where it's not necessary or even disadvantageous. But you can't take it out. Violence will always be a likely component of irregular warfare. The mistake we make is a tendency to make it the predominant element when it doesn't need to be.
Quickly, the civilian side, particularly at policy/political levels, really hates decisions, taking risks, prioritization. And you're not going to change that culture. But, and this isn't just the United States, it's all states that I know of. But there are three things that at whatever level, staff, commander, leader, you can demand of leadership, and it can be forced or bullied into doing so. First is define a mission. Even political people understand that. They don't like it, they'll resist it, but they can be forced to do it. Secondly, pick someone to be in charge. Thirdly, as General Nagata said, ensure that that person that everyone is aware that person has the leader's confidence. That was the beauty of Holbrooke. Everybody knew, because I was in his office once, and when Bill Clinton called him, and presidents don't call assistant secretaries unless his name is Dick Holbrooke. And Holbrooke actually didn't take the call. He was late for a flight, and he said, Clinton never, it was a White House Situation Room putting him on hold. He said, Clinton's never on time. Tell him I'll be available tomorrow. But anyway, this is why everybody, as I said, was afraid of Holbrooke. But, okay, irregular warfare as a tool in containment. In theory, offensive irregular warfare, that is going after the weak link in the other guy's chain, is part of the repertoire of raging a global campaign. But I don't recommend it, because of all the things we're not good at, we're really bad at that. Case in point, after containing and deterring and pushing back the North Koreans from South Korea, we decided we would roll back North Korea, and we got a war with China. We did for years in Albania an attempt to roll it back because it was cut off from the rest of the communist world when Tito pulled out of what became the Warsaw Pact. We didn't succeed there. And finally, let's not forget the Bay of Pigs. That was us doing irregular warfare to take down the other side, and that didn't turn out well. In terms of defensive, obviously the other side will be using irregular warfare against us. We have to be willing to do it. Now, violence and struggle. In the 40-minute version of the presentation, which I think I kindly didn't inflict on you, I would describe how most of the Cold War were irregular warfare. We only had a few conventional confrontations, and other than the shoot-down of U-2, none of them led to actual combat. Berlin, 48, the Yom Kippur War, and obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. The rest were all regular warfare, and the last of them, in the 1980s, Nicaragua and Afghanistan, but there was a third. Those two obviously involved violence. It was the struggle for the European public, legitimacy and loyalty of the European publics towards their NATO state governments over the Pershing cruise missile deployment in response to the Soviet SS-20 deployment. Now, there was a military component to it. These are missiles with nuclear warheads, but there was no shooting, there was no movements. It was to go after the legitimacy of NATO's decisions to defend itself with a population that was leery about it. That's an example of irregular warfare par excellence.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm going to just plug quickly a piece that Tom Marks and I wrote on this issue in Modern War Institute that follows exactly this logic that you've laid out. And we kind of land on coercion. There's also always a coercive component. It may not be active violence, but it's always a coercive. Otherwise, we're not talking about warfare, ultimately. I see we have some questions. I'm very much looking forward to hearing them. So let's start on this side, and we'll do a sort of zigzag. Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Risha from Lebanon. My question is for General Nagata. I spent most of my career in a unit, the Marine Commando Regiment in Lebanon. A unit that was changed by the strategic generosity you mentioned, and you had a personal part in that. So I couldn't agree more with you about that. However, in terms of how do you apply this to be permanent, this is a very big challenge, especially that us in the Lebanese army, we face a challenge every year going through the fiscal year in the Congress and having guys or congressmen supporting or not supporting of continuing the financial aid, which always give us this feeling of instability in terms of what can we expect from the American administration. It has to do with elections, it has to do with different parties' approach. So what do you think should be done to have that as like a policy that continues, not just one that's changed by elections?
Thank you. Some of my fondest memories were years ago when I had the privilege of visiting your formation and watching really two things that I think I'll carry with me to my grave. One was the professionalism that you and your colleagues were creating, and the second one was the friendships that had emerged between people like yourself and the Americans that were working with you. And over the years, I've thought that may sound a little more emotional than you would think a general officer would engage in, but the strength that came from those two things was deeply impressive to me. So it's wonderful to reunite with someone like you. Thank you. To your question, one of the things that I hear policymakers, not just in the United States government, but in many governments, when they're talking about an international partner, is that they are committed, that they have a sustained commitment to their partner. It's a very common description. This is an enduring, sustained commitment. Unfortunately, Sometimes those words are hollow. It turns out not to be sustained. It turns out not to be durable. Because governments become distracted, they lose interest, sometimes they just get tired of working on a relationship. Speaking as both a U.S. citizen as well as a retired U.S. military officer, it should be obvious to American leaders that the position of the United States internationally depends on our willingness to sustain our partnerships and alliances with important actors like Lebanese armed forces. We will say these things, but we don't always match what we say with what we do. And therein lies the problem. The turmoil that we periodically put Lebanese armed forces through often began in conversations in this town. Unfortunately, I was a participant in some of these conversations when I would be asked to explain why it is necessary to continue to invest in the armed forces of Lebanon. And usually the argument went something along the lines of, because Hezbollah is just so much more powerful, why are we bothering with this? And then I and my colleagues would try, sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we failed, to explain to that senior policymaker who wants to dismiss this relationship that, first of all, we've given our word to these people. We promised them we would be with them. If we break that word, it doesn't just harm our standing in Lebanon. It will cause every other country in the region to ask themselves, so am I the next one that will be let down? Am I the next one that will be betrayed? But just as importantly, it is not a secret that the United States wishes to ensure that bad actors in your region have at least a competitor that believes in democracy, that believes in the rule of law. It can't just be the United States doing these things. We have to enable and empower local actors to defend themselves. Sometimes that argument worked and sometimes it didn't, which is why you were on the end of a very unpredictable relationship, for which I apologize, but I did my best. It's wonderful to connect with you.
Next question. Thank you.
Morning. Patrick Yeager from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was wondering if you had any advice for us, future staff officers. As we move up, we're closer to the boss, but we're not quite the boss. How do we shake the culture so that we can avoid those, well, we're not going to do that moments? How do we respond to those? How do we prevent that from even happening so that we can kind of steer our bosses, our leaders away from, minimum investment for maximum output?
Insist on a clear definition of mission and who is responsible. These are basic things that you learn early on in the military. You learn it in similar ways in the business world. You learn it, as I said, as a scientist with a scientific method. The closer you get to policy, and even at the top, the U.S. military or other countries' militaries are impacted by policy culture, the harder it is to get that, because your bosses are going to have to turn to political leadership. What is our policy towards Iran throughout the Middle East? I've been trying to, I do this for a living, trying to figure out what it is and working with the people whose job it is to do it, and we don't get good definitions. That's the default position. And so you have to fight against that. The second thing is understand the environment and understand what we can do and cannot do. the example of the Lebanese Armed Forces is a good one, because there it's not simply the challenge of the Lebanese. The Jordanians, who we don't ever raise questions about, have the same complaint. Every year it's the same system, but that's inherent to the system. We can't change it. The Saudis, on the other hand, who have seen us and are seeing it again, totally turn off assistance and then turn it back on, depending upon political relationships, are able to, this is the kind of thing that General Nagata is talking about. It destroys confidence. So there are basic things, and you will understand them simply by paying attention to the environment well enough to be able to advise your bosses. The question is, how good are you at persuading, and how good is he or she at listening?
I can't resist adding one thing. This was the kind of cheap advice I used to dispense to people that had the misfortune of working for me after I had done 4 tours in this town. I used to tell people, of all the hostile, complex, and dangerous places I'd had to deploy to around the world, the most hostile, the most complex, and the most dangerous was Washington, D.C. But in all seriousness, the short answer to your question is, your ability to get people to change their minds, which I would argue is fundamentally what you're asking. How do you get a senior official to not do what you know they're about to do, instead choose to do something else? Through relationships. That's how you do it. This town, all national capitals, not just the Washington, D.C., all national capitals function on the basis of personal relationships. I will never claim to have won every argument I've been in this town. My batting average was not particularly great, but I know that the times I did manage to persuade a very senior policymaker to change their mind was built on the back of the fact I had a relationship either with that person or I had relationships with the people that advised that person. And at the end of the day, they made a different choice, not really because my logic was so brilliant. They made it because either the advisor that I was influencing or me directly, they had enough confidence, to use the word the ambassador just used, in me or their advisor that I influenced, that they changed their mind. That is built on the back of a personal relationship.
Good morning, sir. I am Air Commodore Naeem from Pakistan. Sir, as we have discussed that the true motives of United States, NATO, as well as Ukraine are not very clear in the ongoing conflict. And on to the other hand, the Russian strategic objective seems more clear, that it is either avoiding or delaying the Ukraine joining the NATO. So under these conditions, I would seek your guidance that which side is more closer to achieving their strategic objective. And next, I would like to seek your guidance that what is the exit strategy from here? Can there be a win-win situation from both sides, or crushing a reviving power that is the Russia would be a better choice for maintaining the credibility of the existing security arrangement? Thank you, sir.
To some degree, Commodore, you answered your own question. There is a off-ramp to this, and it would get to, if Putin's real, as opposed to public, interest is to keep Ukraine from joining NATO, we came close to, and Zelensky came close to putting that on the table at various points between January and April. But his real goal is, and he doesn't say it, but it's clear, is to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state. That he is not going to achieve, because our minimum goal is to ensure that Ukraine survives as an independent state capable of defending itself. There is room for a compromise in there, and there are people behind the scenes who are working on that would keep Ukraine independent and free, but give, as I said, this is what Dick Holbrooke was doing in the Balkans 25 years ago, give Russia some kind of consolation prize, if you will. That's very hard to do because people are very angry at Russia, and Russia has a maximalist position and is showing very little signal it's willing to compromise. Once and if it does, that will open the door to something along the lines that you have said, because it's in everyone's interest to end this thing before it gets even worse.
I'll just add a comment. As I've tried to compare and contrast Russia versus NATO and a large part of the international community, Russia has a reasonably clear goal, as you've indicated, that I don't think they can achieve. I think that ship has sailed. On the other hand, the US and its allies have a set of vague and somewhat contradictory goals, which I think means nobody knows whether what we're trying to do is achievable, what is achievable, because we don't know what we're trying to do, other than we don't like Russia. We want to punish Russia. That's a pretty weak goal. It's a dissatisfying goal, but that's where we are. I think the logical follow-on to both your question and what I just said is, okay, well then how does this end? Nobody knows, unfortunately. Should we do better than this? Of course we should, but we don't seem capable of it.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Ebelli from the Department of State. It's an incredible pleasure to listen to what you've said. Just a question and then a comment, or a comment and a question. Taking risk is something that we all strive to do, but in the cold light of accountability review boards, it's very difficult for leaders to make those and promote those risks because of the fact that they have to think about, well, what is the review board going to say if this goes bad, for example? And so I think there's a little bit of reticence built in to the system, at least that I've sort of encountered in my career. But my question is really directed at China and containing China. Autocracies control much more GDP, world GDP, than they did 30 years ago. I think more than 30%, even some say close to 40%, which gives them more influence, more power, more ability to bend or indeed break the world system to their own advantage. And so my question is, what is the way forward? Is it a global coalition of economic containment for China, one that sort of resurrects, renovates, rejuvenates the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or some kind of alliance against and containing China? Thank you very much.
To your comment, as someone who's been subjected to repeated accountability review boards for losing people, I've found them fair and reasonable. I think that this is a State Department internal question, but it's a very important one because it has a real impact on the state's ability to get people out in the field to join the military. And I've never seen them second-guess decisions, even though those decisions turned out badly. And they didn't deter me and didn't deter others from continuing to do those decisions. But I think that there is a general political level concern, and we saw this with Benghazi, and then the U.S. military saw it with the death of 4 Special Forces people. I mean, we talk about by, with, and through economy of force using these kind of measures, and they do work very well. Look what we do with handfuls of Department of State offices and Special Forces groups all over Africa and the Middle East. But boy, if we can't handle 4 of them dying in one bad incident and 4 of them dying in another, each of which, when you looked at them, there were reasons to question specific judgment, but that's always the case. The point is, those should be acceptable losses. They're not within the political context, even if the State Department won't hold people accountable. Now, to China, essentially, the national security strategy basically sums it up. You strengthen our own domestic capabilities, emphasis on technology and economics and industry, but also a little bit more subtle, our political unity. 2, our alliance system. 3, our military. And you have an overall strategy to compete with China, that's the way they put it, and to contain Russia because the nature of the two challenges are different. I think it's a pretty good roadmap.
The contrast, for me, the question about things like the consequences of failure and accountability review boards highlights a contrast, or illuminates a contrast, that I don't think enough people in this town think about. And in many ways, the U.S. military is in a weird way kind of the beneficiary of this. Certainly in the last 20 years, it's become very fashionable. It's appropriate, but it's also very fashionable. When a U.S. service member is killed in combat somewhere, there is no shortage of people at the policy level who eagerly get to the nearest microphone to talk about how much they wish to honor the fallen, grieve for their families, ensure they're properly taken care of. But typically what that policymaker will then say is, but the best way to honor our fallen, the best way to pay tribute to their sacrifice is to stay the course, is to redouble our efforts, is to ensure that we ultimately succeed at the noble pursuit that they were once engaged in. That's a military benefit. I would argue it's justifiable, I would argue it's beneficial, I would argue it's appropriate. But then when I see, unfortunately, I have seen some of my interagency civilian colleagues become casualties, I don't see that kind of reaction. Instead, I generally see a contraction. Oh my God, we can't let people go out the wire anymore. We can't let, unless they have an armored vehicle, they can't go anywhere. Unless they have a 30-man protective detail, they can't meet with the tribal chief. Fully knowing that you take a 30-man protective detail with you, the tribal chief's not going to meet with you. And that contrast has been toxic to our ability to do what we claim we're going to do, and that is engage in whole-of-government, interagency collaborative endeavors. We fundamentally disable that notion when we create this enormously dysfunctional contrast between we have a military service member casualty, by God, this only stiffens our commitment to succeed, but we have a civilian become injured or killed, and we immediately recoil from doing anything. That contrast, that dysfunctional contrast, has got to be addressed, but unfortunately, I don't see anybody trying to. I'll be very brief with my second one. The basis of our success in things like irregular warfare lies upon whether or not leaders, both civilian and military, are trained, educated, rewarded, and promoted on the basis of developing skill in this arena. If we don't do that, nothing else matters.
We are almost literally out of time, but I will take one more question. I thought there were some people that have already given up. So never give up. That's
Short, I'm happy to defer to my Jordanian colleague for his question there. Please, sir.
Or we could take both if both speakers are agreed.
Sure.
Okay. Brigadier General Ahmed Jordan, Armed Forces. Sir, primarily we thought that great power competition to make the world more secure. But then I changed my mind when I read the National Security Strategy 2022. In National Security Strategy 2017, China and Russia dealt as interchangeable threat to USA and the world. But in National Security Strategy 2022, they prioritize the China over Russia. Even in 2017, there was no war in Ukraine from Russia, and now we have war there. So what the great power compete for? Thank you.
I'll give you my immediate response. Yeah, you're not the only person that I've heard in the last few months point out this interesting contrast between the fact that at the very same time we are engaged in supporting Ukraine in the first major war in Europe since World War II, but then declaring that China is the greatest threat. Now, in my judgment, those aren't mutually incompatible notions, but I will argue that the United States is being very unclear about what its priorities are. Matter of fact, I'll tell you a quick story. About a month after the war in Ukraine began, I had to make a business trip to Hawaii, and several of the senior leaders at Indo-PACOM are personal friends of mine, so I had lunch with a couple of them. And I asked them all, I said, so how's it going? And they looked at me and they said, Nagata, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, people in Washington, D.C. stopped taking our phone calls, stopped answering our emails, stopped working on our problems, which just proves something we always knew. The government of the United States can only do one thing at a time. Right now, we are hypnotized by Ukraine, and we're not paying attention to anything else. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration, and I'm sure they were complaining for some effect, but it's not fundamentally untrue.
To put less kindly, what General Nagata is saying is the national security policy levels of the United States and perhaps other countries, but certainly the United States, are like the 6-year-old is playing soccer. Everybody runs for the ball. And this is, along the long list of dysfunctionalities that, trust me, folks, we're not going to change. Best you can do is know that they're there and deal with them. Because you go through this and there's some wisdom. And in the case of the national security strategy, I would defend it. Because there's some real strategic thinking and decision-making buried in those 48 pages of let's be kind to the tooth fairy and that kind of thing on page 37. And one thing it says, it makes the case for why China, because it was doing this in the context of, when it came out, of 7 months of everybody running to the ball that says Ukraine, the yellow and blue ball on the field. China is the only country with the intention and the possible capability of truly challenging the global order in a fundamental way. We have concluded, I think correctly, that Russia does not have that capability. It has the ability to disrupt the system, to create a theater of influence that undercuts global security, because if you're sitting in Jordan, you're going to say, boy, if the Russians can get away with that in Ukraine after they got away with that next door to you in Syria, what's going to happen to us? Can we count on our friends in Europe and Washington to take care of us, or in Saudi Arabia? Those are good questions and important ones. Thus, we had to focus on it. So they have differentiated between the bigger threat and the immediate threat. The immediate, more crucial threat, which they use containment on, is Russia. But the longer-term threat that they use, I think, contest, it's a little bit vague, but it's not too bad, is China. It's not a bad way of looking at it. But again, as the General said, in terms of executing things, everybody will drop the China ball. And if it wasn't for Nancy Pelosi going there, you wouldn't have heard about China or Taiwan in the last 8 months. But she managed to put it back in the headlines for a few days, but now it's gone. Nonetheless, in terms of, and you might know a little bit more, Mike, in terms of what DOD is doing, in terms of its priorities for forces, development, and other things, China is the basic deal, isn't it?
It's certainly supposed to be. It's so easy for me to pass judgment on the Pentagon from outside the Pentagon, but I'll go ahead and do it anyways. To me, it just looks awfully inconsistent. There are pockets in the services and in the combatant commands where I do see an appropriate level of energy and enthusiasm for focusing on Indo-PACOM, but there are just as many other pockets where they're playing kiddie soccer, like you just described. They're running to the ball.
I think with that, let me then conclude this session by expressing, I think on behalf of all of us, sincere and tremendous gratitude for you for spending time with us this morning, for sharing your perspectives, for preparing your comments and engaging in what I found fascinating conversation. A small token of our gratitude is just a copy of the recently released second edition of the Crafting Strategy for Irregular Warfare. So here you have the theory to marry up with your extensive practice, and you can see the gaps and contradictions that prevail.
Thank you very much, but this probably would have gone better if we had been given this for home study before we gotten it. And I hope you all noticed I've forgiven General Nagata. When he listed the ages of the adult population, he excluded my cohort of the over 70.
Let me also please thank Ambassador Holtz for setting up this Chancellor Lecture Series and for guiding us out of COVID into the type of face-to-face engagements we've seen today. Thank you to Denise Marsh for doing all of the legwork and helping us at CISA engage with leaders of this caliber. Thank you to Chuck Kosak for being an integral part of our outreach team and for helping to man the Fort Bragg station. To Jake, to Troy, of course, and also to Mario, Grace, and Faith for making this event possible. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen, once again.
Thank you.